Hey, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. On behalf of the Real Property Association of Canada, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on physical climate risks for the commercial real estate industry. My name is Daryl Neat, and I'm the Vice President of Sustainability at REALPAC. REALPAC is a national leadership association representing decision makers from over 130 of the largest commercial real estate organizations in Canada, representing $1 trillion in assets under management. Our core focus is helping solve the industry's most challenging issues. In the area of sustainability, that means managing climate risk. I'm pleased to be joined today by three seasoned experts in the physical climate risk space. Catherine Bakos, Managing Director of Finance and Resilience, the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. Mike Williams, VP of Climate and Performance Engineering at RWDI and Climate First. And Eric Landry, Director of Climate Change from GRESB, Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. They each bring a unique and important perspective to the issue and that I'm sure you'll enjoy. So the next slide shows our agenda for the call. We're going to start out with an overview of the Canadian physical climate risk landscape with Catherine. Going to move on to a little bit of capital planning and financial best practices with Mike, and then on to a review of global KPI and reporting best practices with Eric. We'll spend about half the time on short presentations from each of our speakers, and then the second half of our time with a moderated panel discussion. We welcome any questions you have, and we'd invite you to post those in the chat. We'll do our best to get to as many of these as we can, and we'll do that after the panel discussion. So I'm going to start with just a few quick observations from my side before I hand it over to Catherine. First, three quick points. First, Canada's just concluded a year marked by unprecedented wildfires and near record catastrophic insured losses from extreme weather. I really think the first point to kind of get us started, physical climate risk is a serious issue and it's time to act. Second point I thought I'd make, we need high quality information and tools that we can trust. Our speakers will each address different aspects of this. There's so much out there, but I think it's clear we need the right information at the right time to facilitate good decision-making across organizations in the industry. And third, even with the best information and tools, we need to learn how to navigate the complexity and uncertainty that characterize the physical climate risk space. It's challenging, but it is clear that managing physical climate risk is now expected of serious world-class real estate investors and managers around the globe. So on to our panelists. Catherine, I'd like to start with you for an overview of the issue for commercial real estate. So over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Daryl, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As Daryl said, my name is Catherine Bakos, and I'm Managing Director, Finance and Resilience at the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. For those of you unfamiliar with the Intact Center, we're an applied research center at the University of Waterloo that helps homeowners, communities, businesses, and governments reduce risks associated with climate change and extreme weather events. That's particularly in relation to flooding, wildfire, and extreme heat. So if we actually flip the slide, you can see those key physical climate risks from those photos there. So climate change manifests itself as extreme weather, and as Daryl was saying, these events are becoming more severe. Last year alone, we saw the largest wildfire season on record, devastating flooding and extreme heat events, hurricanes, hail, and wind events. These events cause power outages, supply chain impacts, evacuations, socioeconomic implications, and loss of life. So this is what I'm here to focus on: how climate change is exacerbating extreme weather, what the financial costs are, and more importantly, how well-informed standards and guidelines have already been developed to improve the resiliency of Canada to a changing climate, but they're being deployed too slowly. So this presentation will showcase how commercial real estate owners, operators, and even investors are in a great position to adapt to the physical risks of climate change. So since we only have 10 minutes together, I'm going to get right to it. Next slide, please. So we know, according to authoritative bodies such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Environment and Climate Change Canada, the first two reports on the left, that climate change is real. It has happened, it is happening, and it will continue to happen. We can slow down the rate of change, but we cannot reverse it, at least not with the technology that we currently have. And so the global consensus is that greenhouse gas emissions must fall. And yet, according to the United Nations Environment Program, their emissions gap report of 2023, the report on the top right-hand corner of your screen, finds that international commitments to the Paris Agreement are falling short, and only an urgent system-wide global transformation is going to avoid climate disaster. Now, I do want to say my first few slides are quite depressing, but I promise you there is good news, so just stay with me and we'll get there shortly. To mitigate greenhouse gas emissions are imperative to avoid the worst impacts of climate change in the future, but that will not stop or reverse the damage that's already been done. Therefore, adaptation, building resilience at the level of our homes, communities, and across our businesses must also be an important part of the climate change discussion. And yet, according to the United Nations Environment Program, their adaptation gap report of 2023, the report on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, adaptation financing, planning, and implementation is plateauing. And yet we know that for every dollar that we put into place for adaptation, that saves us on average $3 to $8 over a 10-year period. Therefore, by putting adaptation measures in place now, that will save us as individuals, businesses, and governments over the long term. So since we understand that the impacts of climate change will continue to increase and not enough resources are being put towards adaptation, then the costs associated with climate change will continue to increase. So the question is, well, what are the costs of climate change? Next slide, please. So there's no better witness than the property and casualty, the P&C insurance sector. So this isn't to talk about insurance, but the insurance sector is actually a really good proxy for the growing risk in the system, and it's a very good visual as well. So this image here displays the annual catastrophic insurable losses for Canada. So a CAT loss is any event, flood, wildfire, hailstorm, that triggers $25 million or more of insured losses. So between 1983, which is the start of the graph, to 2008, which is just outside of the gray box region, losses range from approximately $250 to $450 million per year for extreme weather events. That's what insurance companies would pay out. Now, as you can see from 2009 onward, which is within the gray boxed region, there's this discernible upward trend in losses. So losses now average approximately $2.1 billion per year, with 14 out of the 15 of the last years being above $1 billion. For 2023, losses reached $3.4 billion, ranking it the fourth worst loss year in insured Canadian history. Now, the losses represented here are corrected for inflation as of 2023 and per capita wealth accumulation. So we are looking at a comparison of apples to apples year over year. It's also important to note that these are insurable losses. Multiply this graph by 3 to 4 times, which is the rule of thumb, and you'll get uninsured losses. So let's use 2023 as an example. 3.4 billion in insured losses would equate to $9 to $12 billion of uninsured losses that individuals, governments, and businesses such as commercial real estate are paying out of pocket for. Now, if we were to isolate for each individual extreme weather event, flooding is greater than 60% of all losses throughout Canada. So flooding is the costliest extreme weather event in Canada. Now, from an insurable perspective, losses are mostly coming from flooding manifesting itself as flooded basements for residential housing. Uninsured losses impact buildings such as commercial real estate and critical infrastructure. So given that we understand costs are increasing, what do we do about it? Next slide, please. So I know I've given you a lot of bad news, but as I promised, here's the good news. And there is good news. And the good news is that guidance and tools are already available to reduce the key physical climate risks in Canada: flooding, wildfire, and extreme heat. So our team at the Intact Centre has worked with subject matter experts across Canada to develop practical, meaningful, and cost-effective ways to adapt to the physical risks of climate change. So on this slide, I've provided guidelines to reduce the risk of flooding at the level of the home, community, commercial real estate, and the importance of retaining and restoring natural infrastructure, wetlands, grasslands, and forested areas. In regards to wildfire, the Intact Centre has worked with Fire Smart Canada to develop wildfire protection measures at the level of the home and community. And in the bottom right-hand corner, the Intact Center has investigated the impact extreme heat has on infrastructure and services, and what can be done from a behavioral change and planning perspective, green infrastructure solutions using nature, and gray infrastructure upgrades for commercial buildings. So there's a lot of great resources for all of you to utilize. All of our information is freely available on the Intact Center website. So please go to our website under reports and resources if you're interested. But since we have a limited amount of time together, I am only going to focus on what we can do at the level of commercial real estate for the costliest extreme weather event, flooding. Next slide, please. So flood resilience guidance for commercial real estate has already been developed for Canada, including 20 practical actions to help businesses get their property portfolios climate ready, which was detailed in the report on the left-hand side of your screen ahead of the storm. So our team at the Intact Center distilled that report down into the actions listed on the infographic on your right to highlight the key areas of focus owners and operators should be focusing on. So that would include plans and procedures, emergency plans, practice drills, tenant communications, equipment and supplies. So the availability of critical equipment and supplies on site, backup power generation, elevator water sensors, flood barriers, and major retrofits. Elevating critical infrastructure above potential flood levels, installing drains, and protecting server rooms. As well, all of this information offers what to do during and after a major flood event. And the full guidance from ahead of the storm and this easy-to-use infographic, as I said, are freely available on our website. So if you're interested, please go check it out. And more importantly, it was all developed with support of REALPAC. Next slide, please. So taking the guidance that I just described, and then the understanding that institutional investors have a large role to play in investing assets throughout the commercial real estate sector, the Intact Center developed a framework which can be found in this series of reports that we've dubbed the climate risk matrices. So the climate risk matrices prioritize the top means by which extreme weather, flood, wildfire, wind could negatively impact the operations of a company within a given industry sector, while identifying actions key market stakeholders should expect a company to take to mitigate against prioritized risks. Now, to determine these key risks and mitigation measures, our team engaged subject matter experts. So these are experienced senior level people who've worked in a specific industry sector for an extended period of time. So based on this subject matter advice, a core group of climate risks most material to business operations were identified and then distilled down into one page per industry sector. So we've completed climate risk matrices for industry sectors, including financials, utilities, and commercial real estate. So let me show you what a commercial real estate climate risk matrix looks like. Next slide, please. So for groups like institutional investors who are overwhelmed by the concept of climate change, thinking it's a large-scale problem with limited solutions, our tool offers specific ways to tackle these issues. So based on subject matter expertise within commercial real estate, we were able to identify the top physical climate risks most material to business operations, which were listed on the top row. So you'll see them as flooding, wildfire, extreme heat, windstorms. Now, of all of those 6, we were actually able to distill those down to the greatest 2 risks, flooding and windstorms, which are actually highlighted on the slide with the use of an exclamation mark in each column. So we've identified the key risks. Then we identify how those key climate risk impacts, or more specifically, how they're going to manifest on the ground. So if we just focus on flooding for our conversation today, the greatest risk is that property damage and business continuity disruptions increase if critical equipment is damaged or rendered unworkable. Next slide, please. So from identifying key risks to how they're going to manifest, below that, just the slide before. So we've identified the key risks and how those risks are going to manifest. And then below that, we identified the risk reduction measures. So in the case of flooding, those managing commercial real estate should ensure that critical equipment is elevated above expected flood levels. And if that's not feasible, these systems must be flood proofed. The climate risk matrices even offer key questions that an investor should ask of commercial real estate companies to ensure they're thinking about these risks and incorporating them into decision-making, thus driving adaptation. Next slide, please. So finally, the federal government has taken steps to address the impacts of extreme weather by releasing Canada's National Adaptation Strategy to ensure that we have direction for climate change resilience in the country. Now, in order to achieve the longer-term goals of resilience within commercial real estate, there are specific objectives and targets for codes and standards, infrastructure decision-making, and resilient infrastructure funding, as you can see on this slide. You may ask, well, how do we achieve these goals? Well, everything that we've discussed today could be directly applicable to these targets. And so the commercial real estate sector is actually in a great position because they have guidance available and a means to make direct contribution to limiting extreme weather risk at the asset level. I'm going to end my presentation there and flip it back over to Daryl. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Catherine. A lot of good information in a very short time, and practical references and tools as well. Thank you very much. Mike, I'd like to go to you next for an overview of one approach to capital planning and financial best practices. So over to you, Mike.
Fantastic, Daryl. I do have control of the screen. Wonderful. Thanks for setting the stage, Kathleen. We certainly have many hazards that are putting pressure on commercial real estate. I'm going to talk about how those hazards then manifest themselves into a risk at a building level. But then perhaps a step further, how you can begin to quantify that risk. And once you can begin to quantify the risk, you can really begin to capital and financial plan as we think about these physical risks within our businesses. Slight lag, apologies for that. When we think about managing climate-related risks, it's helpful context for me to think about this as two big buckets. Bucket number one, reducing emissions and managing transitional risks. I think we all know what this is about, and we have to continue to try to drive our economy towards a zero carbon future. But as Catherine spoke to, the reality is that the change is upon us, and in many respects, it's out of control and is going to continue to manifest itself into the future. And so we now very much need to manage these physical risks of changing climate. There's some interesting statistics out there suggesting that 90% of investment and efforts to date have gone towards managing transitional risks. I think we really need to see that level of effort and investment really start to shift towards the right side, towards physical risks, in that these risks are very much upon us. We saw the billions of dollars of insured damage, and yes, I think it's probably true that needs to be multiplied by 3 or 4 to capture the total amount of damage. When I think about these physical risks, I find it helpful to categorize it into two sub-buckets. Thinking about the chronic risks, so these are some of those slow changes over time, increases in precipitation, increases in heat. And as I start to think about it in this category, I can start to think about how these slower changes manifest themselves into challenges with respect to ongoing building operations. And then we certainly have the acute risks, major flood events, extreme wind, wildfires that cause those immediate losses to a building. So let's unpack these chronic and acute risks and how they can manifest themselves into a risk to a building. So chronic risks, when we think about chronic risks, heat is a great example. There are, I don't know how many stats out there about the heat increase in Toronto, but I thought this was interesting, seeing an article in Toronto Life recently talking about climate risks and how that is very much becoming on the conscious of everyday people, not just us professionals practicing in the area, suggesting that heat in Toronto is going to move from an average high of 34.2 up to 42 degrees by the year 2080. This is certainly going to put additional stress on buildings and their ability to operate, but what is that additional stress? What is really at risk? I've seen suggestions that as a result of a risk of increase in temperature, the entire value of a building is at risk. I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think these are certainly risks, but I think they're risks that with prudent planning, they can be managed. But how do we go about translating that threat into a risk to a specific building? So I find it helpful to break it down to a building system level of resolution. And so if we think about a chiller in a building, it has a useful life. So let's say that this chiller was installed in 1999. It will need to be replaced in give or take 25 years. And that will require a $350,000 investment at that time. And then in another 25 years, another $350,000 invested in its replacement. But that would assume that the climate continues to act as it historically has. But the statistics are very much saying that will not be the case. When we think about increases in temperature, perhaps the best KPI when we think about a piece of cooling equipment is the number of cooling degree days. So this is an indication of how hard a piece of cooling equipment is going to have to work to be able to meet load within a building. That KPI is anticipated to increase by over 250% as we head out to 2060. We can then estimate how much harder a piece of cooling equipment is going to have to work and what impact that might have on that piece of equipment's serviceable life. And so we've estimated that that will reduce this chiller's serviceable life from 25 years to 16 and then down to 12. We can then translate that onto a climate adjusted cost of capital to maintain the functional performance of this piece of equipment. And so we can see that we would anticipate 3 replacement cycles over the next 30 years, where there would just be 2 under a no change climate scenario. We can then compare these 2 cash flows and come up with a very pointed climate value at risk to this specific piece of equipment. Being able to drill down to climate value at risk to this level of resolution, we have found to be tremendously powerful to help us understand where we need to begin to drive action and make specific investments at a building level. If we now think about acute risks, I'll reference that Toronto Life article once again, where they spoke about on July 8th in 2013, in just 90 minutes, we saw over 1 meter of rainfall, which caused, I think it was north of $1 billion of damage was reported as a result of that rainfall event. This one hit very close to home. I remember it, July 8th is actually my birthday, so enjoyable to celebrate a climate disaster on your birthday. But I remember I was on the east end of the city and it was only just beginning to rain. And my girlfriend, now wife, called me from downtown Toronto in an absolute panic, saying she could barely see 6 inches in front of her. I managed to get downtown and it did feel like the city was coming to an end. That said, it's amazing how quickly the city was able to recover. And while these are challenging events, I would also say that they aren't reasons to fully divest from a city from like Toronto. And I think we can think more pointedly about what is specifically at risk to these acute events when we think about commercial real estate. And so I'll walk you through a similar example as I did with the chiller. We'll think about this backup generator that is often a system that is used to support functional performance of a commercial real estate asset. We can estimate that if this chiller saw a flood event of 1 meter or greater, that would exceed its impact threshold and cause that system to fail. Based on historic climate records, we know that that event is anticipated to happen at a 1 in 100 year interval, or a 1% year over year probability. We can then look at that piece of equipment's installation cost, and we can annualize the expected loss by multiplying it by the probability of the flood event occurring to get a $2,800 average annualized loss. We can then again look out over the next 30 years and come up with a baseline contingency. But similar to the example with the chiller, the climate is changing, and forward forecasts suggest that these extreme rainfall and flood events are going to increase in frequency. For this specific site, we can see that the 1 meter flood event is anticipated to increase to a frequency of 1 in 80 years. Again, we can convert that into a probable loss of 1.25% chance of that event occurring, multiplying that by the installation cost to get an adjusted annual cost of $3,500. We can multiply that out over the 30 years and get $105,000 as the expected loss for this piece of equipment over the next 30 years. And in that, we can get a very pointed climate value at risk to this specific piece of equipment. We can then run this same analysis across all the critical systems that are required for a building to perform its primary function. And so first, we can do a baseline forecast of what we would anticipate it to cost to maintain the functional performance of those pieces of equipment. And then we can adjust that, that understanding based on downscaled global climate models that are going to put additional pressure on many, if not most, of these systems, and come up with a climate adjusted cumulative capital forecast. Powerfully, we can then look at the climate value at risk at any point in time and can really begin to think about, well, what is at risk to this building? And then we can unpack that understanding of climate value at risk down to a system level of resolution, so we can think about where we might begin to make increased investments in the building to shore it up against these very known physical climate risks. We'll make a very slight plug for Climate First. We've developed a software solution that allows this calculation methodology to happen near automatically, and getting to leveraging software to be able to scale these types of solutions we think is absolutely critical. It's give or take 6.5 million commercial buildings in Canada and US alone. And so I think we're going to need software, we're going to need automation so that we can try to bring solutions like this to every commercial real estate property. So that was a quick rundown on some thinking about different ways that we can capital plan going forward in a changed climate. And now I'll hand it back to Daryl.
Thanks, Mike. Really good and interesting to see, bringing hazards down to building and equipment level and kind of translating that into the capital plans. Thank you for that. Eric, you're up next, and really interested in your perspective on, where do real estate organizations in Canada and around the world sit pertaining to physical climate risks, with the unique perspective and vantage point you have at GRES. So over to you, Eric. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Daryl, and two really great presentations, so I hope to follow it up. My name is Eric Landry. Thanks for having me today. I'm the Director of Climate Change at GRESB, and I'll be coming at this, again, as Daryl had just mentioned, from a kind of a more global perspective of an ESG data steward for real assets. So let's see if I can control the screen. Here we go. So for those of you who are not aware, GRESB is the global ESG benchmark for real assets. We essentially sit between financial institutions and asset managers, portfolio companies, and property companies as a sort of in between, where we absorb data, we clean that data, we score it, we benchmark, and we provide that data both ways to improve kind of the state of the industry, and so everyone is speaking the same vocabulary and knows where they are. The vision is an investment industry that plays a central role in creating a sustainable world. And the way we go about doing that is, again, to kind of provide that common language of ESG data. Now, some of that data is regarding physical climate risk and the processes surrounding that we see property companies engaging in. And that's what we'll be looking at today. So from the GRESB 2023 real estate assessment, we've teased out some conclusions or some observations that we've seen based on that data. So if we look at the graph really quickly, we see the share of entities, and so these are participating entities that provide us with data. The share of entities with a process for identifying, so a systematic process for identifying physical risks with potentially material financial impacts. And what we see here actually across regions, so we have global, Canada, USA, Asia, Oceania, and Europe. We see actually that the share of Canadian respondents to our assessment has a lower, I guess, share of entities that have a systematic process in place for this. So that's potentially one area that that you can consider when taking a look at who's managing what. But maybe that's a quite simple data point. What becomes more, I guess, more colorful is when you get down to, okay, well, once you have a process in place, what is actually being kind of unearthed? And that's what we'll get down to in the bottom row here. So compared to a global average, we find that a greater share of Canadian entities identified exposure to most acute hazards or chronic stressors. Now, a data point like this requires a bit of interpretation because it's not quite as simple as being able to say, oh, well, if they're reporting that they have more of these chronic stressors, that must mean that they have more exposure to these climate hazards than in the rest of the world. That's not necessarily true. It could be that actually once these Canadian entities go ahead and run these climate assessments, they're just better at finding them. There may be more sensitive models that are able to pick up exactly where they have more exposure, where another entity, say another place in the world, might not have been able to pick up that same amount of exposure or deemed it material to them. So there's always multiple ways to look at data, and it's important to be able to understand exactly what the data is saying. Moving quickly along to the kind of middle of the page, we have the observation that fewer Canadian entities identified reduced revenues from lower sales or output as a material indirect impact. And then finally, a greater share of Canadian entities identified increased operating costs as a material indirect impact. So again, these data points are a bit simplistic. These are just aggregations of essentially what are checkboxes, but it does provide maybe a baseline as to, oh, if other Canadian entities are indeed seeing the same sort of impacts from climate-related hazards that your own institution might be seeing. So these are maybe again a little kind of statistics based, but to get a maybe more in-depth view of how people are going about interpreting this, we can go to the next slide and we'll see we've dug into the actual textual responses. So in what we call open text boxes. So our participants can write whatever they want and explain in detail how they run their processes. So on the left, we have processes for prioritizing physical risks, and this is specific to Canada. And then on the right, we have what we see with regard to integration of those processes into overall risk management. And this is looking not just at Canada, but what all of our respondents are saying. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read all the bullet points, but just to run through kind of the headers, the bold headers, we have the fact that in Canada, we're seeing a lot more comprehensive risk assessment frameworks like the one that Mike was mentioning before, where we're actually seeing damage functions and climate value at risk. Oh, I'm going to go back. Sorry. Where we're actually seeing things like climate value at risk being calculated and used to inform decision-making on whether it's maintenance or retrofit decisions or things like this. Systemic screening and due diligence, another area where physical risks are being prioritized, and adaptive and resiliency planning, a lot of what Catherine was saying beforehand around how to plan for the long term, and not just in terms of a single asset, but also on the scales of a community or even a city. On the right, again, since we're talking about integration to overall risk management, obviously integrated risk management frameworks came into play a lot. Cross-functional collaboration, you're going to need those climate teams, the ones who are assessing the data and running these tools and software, to be able to coordinate and integrate into the kind of more standard, as it were, risk management functions across an organization. And then last but not least, the environment is changing, the data is changing, the methodologies are changing. So we're seeing kind of an emphasis on continuous improvement and making sure that these processes reflect the most up-to-date understanding and kind of best practice. And then finally, what I'd like to leave with is considerations when taking a look at all of the data that's out there now. I remember back in 2017 when the TCFD kind of came out with its recommended disclosures and physical risk kind of came onto into the spotlight. There was a proliferation of these physical risk data providers or climate service providers. And with that proliferation came the hunt for the best data. And well, spoiler alert, there is no best data. There's no most accurate or precise or most correct data. It really depends on your use case and what you want to use that data for. So here are some of the considerations. There are 5 of them here. Does the data cover the hazards you want? If a data provider says, yeah, we have floods, well, is that kind of some amalgamation of pluvial floods and fluvial floods and coastal floods, or would you like that kind of granularity to be able to break up those types of floods? That might be quite important when you're dealing with well, your geographic specificity. In terms of timeframes, does it cover the timeframes you want? Now, this might be a little more important for infrastructure than it is for real estate. But for different types of financial investors who have different investment strategies, some opportunistic, some core funds, timeframes can come into play in terms of, well, what their use cases for using climate data and assessing the risks of the assets in their portfolios. Does the data cover the scenarios you want? And this one's a tricky one because even if you have multiple scenarios, depending on the time frame, especially if it's a short time frame, a lot of those scenarios will say the same thing because, well, there's a lot of climate momentum in a lot of those scenarios. The variability outweighs the kind of divergence of those scenarios in the long term. So it's important to kind of decide, okay, well, if you're going to use this for disclosure purposes, maybe you want a couple scenarios, but also you might want to use it as a sense check on kind of the range of climate futures that you might want to see or might not want to see. Resolution is a pretty simple one. Obviously, if you're dealing with flood, you'll want a much greater resolution, maybe 30 meters by 30 meters than you would for something like drought risk, which 30 meters by 30 meters drought risk might be a little overkill. And so 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers might be perfectly sufficient for that use case. So does it have the resolution for those hazards over those timeframes that you really need to make your decisions? And then last but not least, how is that data presented? There's a lot of climate providers out there that will give you a score from 1 to 10 on all of their different hazards. Is that useful for how you want to use it? If you want to plug in something into Climate First, Mike's tool, maybe you might need something a little more specific about return periods on a specific severity of flood. That would provide, the kind of input that sort of software would need. So it's important to not just get something that's easy, plug and play or click around, but also, are other systems going to be based off of this data and make sure it's usable? So with that, I'll stop there and hand it back over to Daryl. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eric. Really nice overview, kind of where Canada sits, Canadian firms sit, and also thinking about, when you're looking at providers, some of the key considerations. Really appreciate those comments. Okay, we're gonna move on to a little bit of a conversation here now, and just kind of walk through and bring some color to the points that we've heard. Catherine, maybe I'll go back to you and I'll start. First question is, what do you think is, kind of in light of everything that we've kind of shared to date and on the topic, what do you think is easy and what do you think is hard when you think about physical climate risk?
A great question. The good news is what's easy is we actually have really good data available. There's great research groups like the Intact Centers and others who've determined how do we reduce the risk in the are the actions that we need to take to get risk out of the system. As both Mike and Eric were mentioning, there are other tools to identify those risks. So I think the good news is we have tools and resources available. The hard part is to actually do this. There's cost associated with this, especially equipment and major retrofits. There is a substantial cost to that. Work at the Intact Center, one of our reports, if anyone's interested, transitioning, it was one of those series of reports, the Institutional Investor Report, transitioning from rhetoric to action. The Climate Risk Matrix report, we actually did a case study to look at when is the best time to adapt. So we did a cost analysis on share price for commercial real estate, a commercial real estate company. And what we determined was that over whether to adapt now, in 3 years, or never, what's the most cost-effective strategy? And what we determined was it's more cost-effective to adapt now rather than to wait. So that's easier said than done. Again, the hard part is there's cost associated to it. The good news is there are many resources available on how we can get risk out of the system.
Thank you, Catherine. Very clear, very punchy. And Mike, I think that's a nice segue to you. Kind of lines with some of your comments when you're showing the cost of capital and kind of different impacts at an equipment or at a specific piece of equipment level. Maybe same question. What do you think is easy and what do you think is hard from where you sit, Mike?
Yeah, I think I don't know whether it's easy or hard, but I'd encourage people to get started. And I think there's some things that you can do that are relatively easy to get started. And doing a risk hazard screen across your portfolio, I almost think of that as like a level 1 assessment is a great activity to undertake. There's a lot of different providers out there, as Eric alluded to, that can help provide you different levels of resolution. So I thought his 5 points, I should have taken a screen cap of that, so it'd be great if we could get the slides, but those would be 5 really good criterion to be thinking about when you're contemplating a provider of those various risk hazard screens. And I really think of that as a level 1, and the cost for that has become sufficiently accessible that most folks with a portfolio of commercial real estate can do that. Next step, and I think of it as a level 2, but really thinking about how those identified hazards translate themselves onto a risk to your specific building. And I really think of that as a climate value at risk assessment. There's new solutions coming on market. I gave you an overview of the approach that Climate First has taken, but I think that is a really important next step to really think about how those hazards translate themselves to a risk to your specific building. And then level 3, at least the way I sort of frame it up in my head, is to undertake engineering-led assessments out at particularly tricky sites. And so when I kind of break it down into those 3 levels, hazard assessment level 1, climate value at risk assessment level 2, and then boots on the ground engineering level 3 studies, I find it can make it a little bit less intimidating for people, that you can take this in bite-sized chunks and work your way through understanding what your key physical risks are. So that's maybe how I'd think about what's hard, what's easy, and maybe a little bit about how to get started.
Thanks, Mike. That's helpful. Eric, what about from your perspective? What do you see as easy and hard?
Well, I was thinking about this before, and Catherine stole my answer. The easy part is just the amount of resources out there. So I'll just echo her here. And she showed a lot of the great resources that have come out of the Intact Center. So I'll stop repeating there. In terms of what's hard, we're getting to the point where exposure to different hazards and chronic stressors is now, base level. And then as Mike has said, the second step is kind of how does that manifest and translate into something like climate value at risk. And so that's kind of how I think of it. I think of three somewhat similar steps: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptation. And I think the hard part will be essentially that third step, which is once you get this very precise and really good understanding of climate value at risk, how do you transform that and how do you flip that into a business opportunity at the asset level? And I'm not sure if there's a really great answer for that, because when for the kind of the stakeholders that we deal with in terms of like institutional investors providing capital to property companies, they're often very concerned with, okay, well, where's my risk? And if the risk is too high, well, maybe that might shift something around. But what we'd like to see is that adaptation, is for them to provide capital to do something about it. But a lot of the best ways forward are not only at the asset level to protect asset level value, but they have to be kind of more holistic solutions that incorporate community-wide resilience and city-wide resilience. So how to weave all these things together, not just to show how much your balance book is going to get hit, but also how to transform that into a maybe a more positive more solution-oriented kind of positive business case. So I'm not sure if that's been solved yet, but I'm sure there's some answers in the resources that were provided before.
No, interesting point. Just want to add from my perspective, I think on the hard side, and I think it aligns with what everyone is saying. I think one of the hard parts is really integrating it into decision making. So what are asset managers, development professionals, investment professionals in real estate companies going to do differently, and when? I think it is difficult. It is challenging once you have the information. How do you incorporate that into your models, and what do you do differently? I know speaking to one of our members recently, had a fairly interesting perspective, talking about how they don't believe the market knows how to price physical climate risk right now, and that it was a key part of decision making for recent disposition of the U.S. multi-res portfolio that they had, physical climate risk. Just trying to take some of that risk off the table. So I think that's where you bring it down into actual decisions. Do we buy? What do we buy? What do we sell? What are acquisition and kind of disposition strategies? And so I thought that was interesting. That was the first example I'd heard of really kind of integrating that into a major decision for a disposition. So, but I do think that is a challenge. It comes down to decision making for asset managers, investment development professionals, and I think that is hard, because it is new and we are all still learning and working our way through it. I don't think there's any silver bullet. Okay, maybe just moving on to our next question, then maybe we'll, I see a few questions coming in from the chat as well. I wonder if you could kind of take out your crystal ball and look forward. Where do you see things going? What's coming next? Obviously, there's a lot to deal with from everything we've talked about, but if we just take a think, is this going to continue to accelerate? Is this going to kind of move along? Are all the tools and solutions out there? Are there going to be more? I wonder just what comes to mind as you think about what's coming next. And maybe Eric, I'll start with you and then reverse come back to you, Catherine. I'll go Eric, Mike, and then Catherine. What do you see coming next?
Yeah. Well, I see, coalitions and best practices coming out to solve what I thought was hard. There's actually been whispers around. So there was a framework called PCRAM, which is let's see if I get the acronym right, the Physical Climate Risk Assessment Model, I believe, or methodology. And that was run out of a coalition called CCRI, but now it's been transferred over, the stewardship over to IIGCC. And it was about how to make that business case and how to look forward and say, okay, well, if we take a systems engineering view of it, and with all the uncertainty and things that could go wrong, how can we be flexible and create a business model that rewards resilience? And granted that that methodology was built with infrastructure in mind, but there have been kind of potential plans for that to come all the way around to real estate. So I'm hoping that makes a debut, you know, in the near future. But you know, in other kind of another sense, I would say I hope that, you know, a lot of where the industry is at right now, I think, is just running climate risk analyses for the sake of it, sometimes just ingesting whatever data is available for the sake of it, for maybe regulatory disclosure or saying that you've run a climate risk assessment or something like this. And I'd like to see that move away from a checkbox exercise to something more decision useful, using the softwares like Mike was showing, and being able to make actual actions. Yeah, I guess that's what I see coming. I mean, actually, I mean, software like what Mike was showing, actually, I'm pretty impressed with it. I mean, I would have said that was the future, but it's here already.
Thank you. No, interesting comments. So just one loop back on PCRAM. That is a that is a standard, you know, kind of a default standard, and it's something that is evolving. I just want to clarify that before I move on.
It's a methodology, and it's a 4-step methodology by which they're not really so tacked onto specific climate data or specific KPIs, but actually it's more about the process. And if you've thought about specific things before you move on to the next stage. So it's very process-based, it's very contextual, and it can be used for most use cases when considering how to translate physical climate risk into investment kind of metrics like cash flow and valuation and insurability and things like this.
Got it. Thanks, Sarah. Mike, maybe next question to you. What do you see coming next?
I think increased focus on physical climate risks. There's some interesting statistics out there saying 90% of investments into climate risk management for commercial real estate have been directed towards transitional risks. But the reality is these physical risks are upon us, and investments are going to have to be made. I don't envision a future where we don't need buildings to provide us shelter from the storm. And so if these buildings are going to be able to provide that shelter, they're going to have to be sufficiently prepared for a much different climate future. That all sounded a bit negative, but I'm actually very positive on this. I think that we will solution our way out of this challenge. And I think that we've, as a society as a whole, have tackled many very large challenges. And I think we can step up and tackle this one as well. So yeah, I think there'll be a lot greater focus on physical climate risks as we head into the future. But I think that that's a challenge that many of us are very much up for.
Thank you, Mike. And last word to you, Catherine, on this. Go on the questions.
I really have to just kind of follow suit with what Mike was saying. I feel a lot of my conversations, and not just within commercial real estate, but across industry sectors in Canada, so much emphasis, and we see this in the media, we see this all of that, so much emphasis is being placed on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, which I take it back to my presentation is incredibly important. But I always say to business leaders that you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions at site level or across supply chains, but you could still be impacted by the physical risks of climate change. And so we have to be thinking about it from both sides. We have to think that if your asset is impacted by physical climate risks, it's going to cost you. I had mentioned a statistic that if you put $1 in for adaptation, it saves you $3 to $8 over a 10-year period in cost avoidance. That's money. It's not a return on investment, but it's money you don't have to pay out over a longer term period. But then that's money, in my opinion, that's also an opportunity cost that's not being lost. That's money that's now available to use for other initiatives. So I really agree with Mike and Eric both that I think I don't think the market is there yet. I think more information, we need to price the risk better. We need to understand the risk, but the risk is in the system and we have to start putting measures in place. And I think more organizations are really going to start taking those steps. And I think REALPAC, I really have to, Daryl, your team, I really have to give acknowledgement of the leadership there and really putting emphasis on the importance of physical climate risk. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you all. I'm going to go to the comments here and just see. I think we had one question a little bit earlier, but thank you, Karen Frizzell, for the link to PCRAM. Appreciate that. And Matt, I appreciate your comments around insurance providers as well. I see another one that comes in. Maybe I'll take the last one that just came in here first. Does GRES plan to standardize how climate risks are assessed for reporting purposes and in general for an accurate comparison? Thank you, Saida. Eric, I think that's for you.
Yep. So similar to, my comments about interpreting some of those data points, when designing something, it's difficult to set a particular standard. For instance, if you go ahead and, you could imagine GRES going ahead and running its own climate assessment. I mean, we know where all the assets are, so we could run our own climate data against everything and just give you a score. But there's a lot of things to consider in that. All of the things that I said before, but not only that, but that climate data is better in some areas, not better in others, and it's always going to depend. There will be large divergences in views of what kind of climate data should be used for that. So for GRES to now granted, you're not saying that GRES should go ahead and do that. But even in terms of standardizing how climate risks are addressed, this is an evolving field, and new tools and new methodologies and new understandings are coming out all the time. So standardization is maybe a tough way to go, because we don't want to necessarily stop the industry from innovating and figuring out and trying new things and making their own risk assessment processes better. Now, in terms of comparison, GRESB is in the name. It's part of benchmarking, but comparing, again, exposure to different climate risks comes with its own challenges, simply because, well, it's difficult to put all the context behind it in a simple form, in a score or in a benchmark or in a distribution or something like this. So without a lot of that hands-on context, it would be almost impossible for us to pass judgment or qualify or compare a lot of this more contextual, process-driven, exercises. So I mean, those are some of the challenges. Again, if we see a lot of those best practices and a lot of those initiatives come together through something similar to PCRAM or maybe the same, then and if they tackle real estate, then we could see at least maybe raising the minimum bar and seeing who is going about some of these kind of more standardized, more common practices to at least raise the tide. Maybe that's not a good analogy for this case, but yeah.
Thank you, Eric. No, I hear. I think short answer being not leaning towards doing it is what I'm hearing you say as well. So no, fair enough. Listen, time is our enemy. I just thought I'd wrap us up here. Listen, a lot of good comments. Thank you again, Mike, Catherine, and Eric. Great conversation. Lots of really good points. I think we heard that there's been a overwhelming focus on transition risk. A lot more attention will be placed on physical climate risk. Another key takeaway for me was the multiplier effect. Catherine, you mentioned the every dollar invested in adaptation, multiplier of 3 to 8 in cost avoidance. Also the multiplier in insured losses. For every $1, there's 3 to 4 in uninsured losses. So I think that's interesting. Flooding being the most impactful physical risk for commercial real estate. I think we heard that. Mike, really interesting comments and focus on the climate adjusted cost of capital, climate value at risk, looking at the capital plans. I think we heard some mixed results on GRES. Canadian firms being slightly behind in having processes in place to identify physical risks, although it was very slight, and maybe Canadian firms being slightly ahead in terms of considering exposure to hazards and increased operating costs. And then really interesting comments around what's coming next and what's easy and hard. The last thing I would want to point out is that REALPAC did actually launch a physical risk explainer today. Thank you to Catherine and to Mike for their support on that one. Just encourage you to have a look at it. Thank you, Kelsey. She just put a little link there in the chat. But thank you everyone for your time. Time is our enemy. We're now at 2 o'clock our time here. Thanks to everyone for participating, and Mike, Catherine, and Eric once again for your comments. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.